You may find it strange that one of the first signs of inner awakening does not arrive with fireworks, nor with moral triumph, nor even with relief. It arrives quietly, almost suspiciously so. You notice, perhaps with mild surprise, that certain people simply fall away from your life, not with conflict, not with resentment, not even with explanation. They drift out of your inner world as leaves detach from a tree that has entered a different season. And what unsettles you most is not their absence, but the absence of anger within you. For many years, you were taught implicitly, unconsciously, that separation must be violent, that endings require justification, that to cut someone off is an act of cruelty unless softened by guilt, apology, or rage. Yet here you are, doing something that feels almost inhuman by moral standards. You withdraw without hatred. You do not argue your case. You do not seek validation. You do not rehearse old wounds in order to feel righteous. You simply step back internally and the cord dissolves. This is not indifference. Indifference is a defense of the exhausted ego. What you are experiencing is something far more unsettling to the collective psyche. The withdrawal of projection. You see, most human bonds are not relationships in the true sense. They are reciprocal hallucinations. I project onto you the image that completes my unconscious need, and you project onto me yours. We call this friendship, love, loyalty, kinship, and as long as the projections remain intact, the bond feels alive, passionate, necessary, even sacred. But when consciousness deepens, when the psyche begins to reclaim its projections, the bond does not break. It evaporates. You are no longer angry, because anger requires an object inflated with unconscious significance. Anger is the guardian of attachment. When you feel rage towards someone, it is often because they still occupy psychic territory within you. They still matter as symbols, as carriers of shadow, as screens for your unlived life. When awakening begins, that occupation ends, the psyche calls its energy home. Many of you fear this moment because it feels cold. You ask yourself, have I become heartless, detached, superior? These are moral questions, and morality belongs to the ego. The psyche, however, does not operate on moral categories, it operates on necessity. Let me say this clearly, because it will unsettle you. The soul does not negotiate, it reorganizes. When the self, the regulating center of the total psyche, begins to assert itself, it does not ask whom you should keep. It removes what no longer participates in your individuation, and it does so without drama, because drama is the language of the ego defending its structures. You may notice that conversations with certain people begin to feel strangely hollow, not painful, not irritating, simply empty. Their words no longer enter you, their concerns no longer stimulate response. Their emotional storms pass through you like weather observed from behind glass. This is not arrogance, it is the psyche refusing to reenact outdated patterns. The collective will tell you that something is wrong, that real people fight. Explain, repair, endure, but the collective lives through repetition. Individuation is always a heresy. In dreams, this phase often appears as images of walking away from familiar houses without locking the door, or watching a train depart without urgency, or finding yourself in a room where the voices continue but you are no longer addressed. These are not symbols of loss, they are symbols of withdrawal, of libido from outdated psychic investments. You are not abandoning people, you are abandoning roles. Every relationship rests upon an unconscious contract. You play the listener, the fixer, the admirer, the rebel, the wounded one, the mirror. When awakening occurs, these contracts expire, and because they were never consciously signed, they cannot be consciously terminated. They simply dissolve. This is why you do not feel the need to explain yourself. Explanation belongs to the persona, the mask you wore to remain intelligible within the group. But the self does not speak in explanations. It speaks in alignment and misalignment. You might still care. Care does not vanish, but it becomes impersonal. Compassion without entanglement, observation without interference. This, too, frightens people. They prefer your anger to your neutrality, because anger confirms relevance. And now we must address the shadow of this phenomenon, for every awakening carries its own danger. There is a temptation, subtle and intoxicating, to believe that your calm withdrawal makes you evolved, while others are unconscious. This is the inflation that follows initial contact with the self. If you fall into it, the psyche will correct you, often painfully. True individuation does not elevate you above others. It separates you from their unconscious claims upon you. The difference is crucial. If you cut people off in order to feel powerful, superior, or untouched, you are still acting from the ego. Only now it wears spiritual clothing. But if people fall away because the inner dialogue that sustained the bond has ended, then what remains is not power, but silence. And silence, as you are beginning to learn, is intolerable to those who live through noise. You may notice that some react strongly to your quiet distance. They accuse you of coldness, betrayal, arrogance, or emotional death. These accusations are projections of their own abandonment anxiety. You have ceased to play the role that stabilized their inner chaos. The psyche always retaliates when a projection is withdrawn. Do not defend yourself. Defense re-enters the game. At this stage, the most ethical act is restraint, to not explain, to not provoke, to not justify, to allow the separation to occur without spectacle. This feels unnatural because you were trained to maintain bonds at all costs, even when those bonds suffocate the soul. But the soul does not value continuity. It values truth. In alchemical terms, you are entering the phase of separateo. The elements that were once fused must now be distinguished. What was yours must be reclaimed from what was borrowed. This is why solitude begins to feel not lonely, but necessary, not empty, but spacious. And yet, you may grieve not for the people, but for the version of yourself that existed in relation to them. This grief is quiet. It has no story. It passes through the body like a deep exhalation. Do not rush to interpret it. You are not becoming less human. You are becoming less possessed. And possession, my friends, is the true illness of the modern soul. We will continue from here and descend deeper into why this calm, severing feels uncanny. How the archetype of the orphan emerges at this stage, and why the psyche demands fewer witnesses as it approaches its own center. As this process deepens, you may notice that the quiet severing of ties does not come all at once. It unfolds in layers, like a long descent into a cave where each torch you extinguish reveals not darkness, but a different quality of seeing. The psyche, when it truly awakens, does not rush. It withdraws its energy with surgical patience. At this stage, a particular archetype often rises from the unconscious. Though most people misinterpret it at first, it is the orphan, not as the wounded child abandoned by circumstance, but as the psychic figure who no longer belongs to any emotional household. You may still have family, friends, colleagues, lovers, yet inwardly, you feel as though you stand slightly apart, as if the inner door through which you once entered these bonds has quietly closed behind you. This is not alienation imposed from outside. It is an inner exile chosen by the self. The orphan archetype appears whenever the psyche withdraws its dependency on collective structures for meaning. Until now, your sense of identity was nourished by recognition, being seen, needed, mirrored, opposed, but awakening demands a different nourishment, one that cannot be provided by others without distortion. And so, the psyche removes you from emotional economies that once sustained you, but now limit you. People often resist this phase because it feels barren. The ego interprets the loss of emotional intensity as loss of life itself. But intensity is not vitality. Intensity is compensation. The psyche burns brightly only when it is trying to illuminate something it does not yet understand. When understanding begins, the fire settles. You may observe something curious. Your memories of certain people lose their emotional charge. Events that once defined you, conflicts, betrayals, alliances now appear strangely flat, as though they happened to someone else. This is not repression. Repression buries emotion underground, where it festers. What you are experiencing is decathexis, the withdrawal of psychic energy from outdated internal objects. This is why you can think of someone and feel nothing, not bitterness, not longing, not superiority, just absence of pull. The collective psyche cannot tolerate this state because it undermines the economy of mutual entanglement upon which social life is built. When you no longer react, you become unpredictable. When you no longer explain, you become opaque, and opacity frightens those who rely on emotional transparency to maintain control. Intimacy or relevance, some will attempt to provoke you back into engagement. They may resurface old grievances, question your character, or appeal to shared history. This is not malice, it is panic. The unconscious does not surrender its projections easily. Notice how different this is from withdrawal motivated by fear or trauma. Trauma-driven withdrawal is tense, defensive, hyper-vigilant, but awakening-driven withdrawal is relaxed, spacious, almost tender. You do not need to push people away. You simply stop holding them inside. This distinction is crucial because many confuse numbness with awakening. Numbness is the psyche shutting down to survive. Awakening is the psyche reorganizing to become whole. In dreams, this phase often appears as standing at the edge of a gathering without entering. or speaking a language no one else understands, or realizing mid-conversation that your voice carries no urgency. Sometimes the dream figure simply walks away, not chased, not followed, not mourned. These images are not warnings, they are confirmations. What the psyche is doing now is preparing you for a more radical intimacy. Intimacy with yourself, but before that can occur, another illusion must dissolve, the illusion that relationships exist primarily for mutual growth. This belief, popular in modern spiritual discourse, flatters the ego. In truth, most relationships exist to stabilize unconscious patterns. Growth threatens them. When growth does occur within a relationship, it is often asymmetrical. One person awakens, the other feels destabilized. And because most bonds are organized around equilibrium rather than truth, the system reacts, accusations arise, moral pressure intensifies, emotional debt is invoked. You may hear phrases like, "You've changed," "You're not the same," "You don't care anymore." These statements are not observations. They are diagnoses of loss of function. You no longer perform the psychic labor that sustained the relationship. Do not rush to correct this misunderstanding. Understanding is not owed to those who require you to remain unconscious in order to feel safe. At this point, many experience a peculiar loneliness, not the loneliness of being unwanted, but the loneliness of being unseen, not because others cannot see you, but because you are no longer showing them a familiar mask. The persona has thinned, and without it, social recognition falters. This loneliness is a threshold, not a punishment. If you endure it without regression, without rushing to replace lost bonds with new ones that serve the same unconscious function, you will notice something subtle but decisive. Your inner dialogue quiets. The constant internal rehearsal of conversations, explanations, defenses begins to fade. This is not emptiness. It is the psyche no longer rehearsing for an audience. You are beginning to live without witnesses. This is deeply unsettling to the ego, which was formed precisely to be seen, evaluated, and responded to. But the self does not require applause. It requires coherence. Here, another danger arises, the temptation to isolate completely, to confuse psychic autonomy with physical withdrawal. Individuation does not demand exile from humanity. It demands freedom from unconscious participation. You may still engage, speak, even care deeply, but without self-betrayal. The difference lies not in behavior, but in inner posture. You are learning to relate without fusion. This capacity to remain present without being absorbed, to care without rescuing, to listen without internal collapse is rare, and it can only emerge when the psyche has reclaimed its projections from others. Until then, relationships are arenas of possession. Now, let us speak of anger again, because its absence troubles many of you. Anger disappears not because injustice has vanished, but because the psyche no longer experiences injury in the same way. Injury requires identification. You are injured when something attacks an identity you are defending. As identification loosens, anger loses its target. This does not make you passive. On the contrary, it often makes your boundaries firmer, but they are no longer enforced emotionally. They are structural, Like walls that do not shout at intruders, they simply stand. People accustomed to emotional negotiation will find this disturbing. They cannot bargain with silence. They cannot manipulate neutrality, and so they may escalate. Let them. The psyche learns more from observation than from confrontation. If you remain steady here, neither retreating into guilt nor inflating into superiority, you will notice something extraordinary. New forms of connection begin to appear, fewer, quieter, less dramatic, but grounded in reality rather than projection. These connections do not demand constant affirmation. They do not collapse when you are silent. They do not require you to be someone. They tolerate difference. They respect rhythm. They are rare because they require two individuating psyches, not two complementary wounds. But before such connections can stabilize, the psyche often demands a period of apparent sterility. Nothing new enters, nothing old remains. This is the desert phase spoken of in mysticism and alchemy alike, not punishment, purification. You are learning to stand alone without armor, and that is far more dangerous to the ego than dependence ever was. We will continue from here into the deeper layers, into how this state alters your perception of love, why compassion becomes quieter rather than louder, and how the self uses withdrawal not to isolate you, but to realign you with what cannot be taken away. Then let us continue and move further inward, where the psyche becomes less interested in explanation and more devoted to orientation. At this depth, what changes is not merely how you relate to others, but how you experience the very idea of love, meaning, and presence itself. You may begin to sense that what you once called love was inseparable from urgency. It demanded response, reassurance, proof. It burned brightly, but it burned because it was consuming something, often yourself. Now, as awakening deepens, love takes on a quieter form, one that unsettles the sentimental imagination. It no longer begs to be expressed. It no longer fears absence. It does not need constant contact to remain real. This is why you may find yourself loving people you no longer need to keep close. The ego finds this incomprehensible. For the ego, love is possession softened by affection, but the psyche understands love as recognition without claim. And recognition does not require proximity. It does not require continuity. It does not even require mutuality. You may care deeply for someone and yet feel no impulse to maintain the bond. This does not mean the bond was false. It means its function has ended. The psyche, unlike the ego, does not cling to forms. It honors processes. At this stage, many experience a subtle but profound shift in compassion. Earlier in life, compassion was often fused with intervention. You felt compelled to help, to fix, to absorb suffering as proof of goodness. Now compassion becomes observational. You see suffering clearly, perhaps more clearly than before, but you do not rush to dissolve it. You understand that much suffering is not accidental. It is formative, it is necessary, it belongs to the individuation of the other. To interfere prematurely would be a violation. This is why people may accuse you of becoming cold, detached, even cruel. They sense that you no longer enter their pain in the old way. But what they miss is that you are no longer unconsciously feeding on their suffering to maintain relevance or moral identity. You are no longer needed in the same way, and need, disguised as intimacy, was the glue of many past bonds. As this realization settles, the psyche often presents images of vast landscapes, deserts, oceans, night skies. These are not symbols of emptiness, but of scale. You are beginning to sense how small personal dramas are within the larger movement of the self. This perspective does not diminish human experience. It contextualizes it, and context is the antidote to possession. You may notice that silence becomes more attractive than conversation, not because you dislike people, but because silence no longer feels like a lack. It feels like presence without distortion. In silence, you are not performing, you are not anticipating reaction, you are not shaping yourself to be received. You simply are. This is dangerous terrain for the ego, because the ego exists only in relation. It is a mirror structure. When the mirrors fall away, the ego panics. It tries to reattach, to provoke response, to create friction that proves existence. Resist this impulse. There is a sacred loneliness here, one that has been misunderstood in every age. Mystics speak of it in religious language. Alchemists encoded it in symbols of nigredo and albedo. Depth psychology encounters it as the withdrawal of projections that reveals the naked psyche. This loneliness is not meant to be cured. It is meant to be endured. If you do not flee it, something remarkable occurs. The inner world becomes inhabited, not by voices demanding attention, but by images, intuitions, movements of meaning that arise without effort. You begin to sense guidance not as command, but as orientation. You know what to do without justifying it. You know where not to go without explaining why. This is the self speaking not in words, but in direction. And now something else shifts. Your relationship to time. Urgency fades, not because life has lost value, but because you are no longer trying to outrun something inside yourself. Many human connections are fueled by shared urgency, fear of loss, fear of being left behind, fear of not having lived enough. When these fears loosen their grip, the bonds organized around them lose momentum. You no longer rush to maintain continuity. You allow gaps, pauses, absence, and you discover that what is real survives them. What is not real dissolves quietly. At this depth, the psyche often demands integrity over harmony. You may find yourself unable to participate in conversations that once felt natural, not because they are immoral or trivial, but because they are incongruent. You cannot say what you do not mean. You cannot pretend interest where none exists. You cannot maintain emotional theater for the sake of peace. This is not a choice. It is a constraint. Integrity is not a virtue you adopt. It is a condition you submit to. And submission to inner truth always costs something externally. You may lose access to communities that thrived on shared illusions. You may disappoint those who relied on your emotional availability to avoid confronting their own emptiness. You may be misunderstood in ways you cannot correct without self-betrayal. Accept this. To be understood by everyone is to remain unconscious. Here, another archetype stirs beneath the surface, the hermit. But again, not the recluse who rejects humanity out of bitterness, but the figure who carries a lamp inward, illuminating what was previously projected outward. The hermit does not withdraw to escape life, he withdraws to see it without distortion. This archetype does not demand physical isolation, but psychic sovereignty. You can be among people and remain inwardly alone. This is not alienation. It is freedom from invasion. As this freedom stabilizes, something paradoxical occurs. You become more available, not less, but only to what is real. Your presence deepens because it is no longer diluted by performance. Your words carry weight because they are no longer reactive. Your listening becomes sharper because it is not interrupted by the need to respond. And yet, fewer will seek you out. Depth repels those who seek reflection rather than truth. This is the quiet cost of awakening. A smaller world, inhabited more fully. You may wonder at times whether you have made a mistake, whether you have hardened, whether something essential has been lost. These doubts are natural. They are the ego's final negotiations. But observe this: despite the loss, you do not feel fragmented. Despite the solitude, you do not feel empty. Despite the misunderstandings, you feel aligned. Alignment is the signature of the self. The psyche does not reward you with happiness for this work. Happiness is too fragile, too dependent on circumstance. Instead, it offers something more durable: inner consent, the feeling that nothing essential is being betrayed. This is why anger cannot survive here. Anger requires resistance to what is. But you are no longer resisting the psyche's movement. You are cooperating with it. What remains now is the final and most subtle transformation: how you relate to the world without needing it to confirm you. We will move into that next, into the stage where detachment reveals not distance, but a deeper form of belonging, and where cutting people off without anger is no longer experienced as loss, but as alignment with a life that can no longer be lived halfway. Oh, we arrive at the final movement, not as a conclusion, but as a settling, like sediment sinking after long turbulence, leaving the water clear enough to see its own depth. At this point, something decisive has changed, though it is difficult to name without distorting it. You are no longer oriented toward the world as a mirror. You do not approach people, events, or relationships asking, often unconsciously, "Who am I here? What do I become through this?" That question once governed nearly everything. It is the hidden engine of attachment, ambition, conflict, and longing. Now it falls silent. This silence does not mean you have answered the question. It means the question is no longer necessary. You begin to sense that your existence does not require confirmation, not from intimacy, not from usefulness, not from being understood. This is an ontological shift, not a psychological trick. It is as if the psyche has moved its center of gravity inward, beyond reach of ordinary disturbance. And with this shift, your relationship to the world becomes strangely gentle. You still notice suffering, perhaps more acutely than before, but it no longer pulls you into action by force. You no longer confuse response with responsibility. You understand now that much of what appears as urgency is the psyche's attempt to avoid its own depth, To intervene compulsively would be to collude with that avoidance. So you remain present without intrusion. This is where many misunderstand you most profoundly. They assume that care must look like involvement, that love must look like effort, that morality must look like sacrifice. But these assumptions belong to a developmental stage where the ego is still negotiating its worth. You are beyond negotiation, not because you are above others, but because you are no longer trading pieces of yourself for belonging. The world feels different now, not warmer, not colder, but slower. You notice how often people speak in order to anchor themselves, how often they react in order to feel real. You see how identities are maintained through repetition, how loyalties are enforced through emotional debt, how intimacy is confused with access. And seeing this, you do not rebel. Rebellion is still a form of participation. You simply do not enter. This is why the act of cutting people off without anger no longer feels dramatic to you. Drama belongs to rupture. What you experience is realignment. When something no longer fits the inner architecture, it cannot be sustained by will alone, and so it ends not with fire, but with gravity. What remains are relationships that do not demand explanation, connections that can withstand silence, bonds that do not collapse when you change. These are few, they always were. The difference now is that you no longer require many. You may notice that gratitude arises not toward specific people, but toward the process itself. Even those who fell away are no longer seen as mistakes. They were necessary figures in the psyche's long attempt to externalize what had not yet been integrated. Each bond carried a fragment of yourself back to you. Once retrieved, the bond was no longer needed. This is not ingratitude, it is completion. At times, a faint sadness may still pass through you, not sharp enough to wound, not heavy enough to burden. It is the sadness of knowing that most people will never meet you where you now stand. Not because they are incapable, but because the cost is too high for many. They would have to relinquish too much noise, too many roles, too much borrowed meaning. You no longer judge this. Judgment, too, has lost its fuel. You understand now that awakening is not an upgrade, it is a narrowing, a stripping away of what cannot accompany you further. The path becomes thinner, quieter, more exacting, and yet, paradoxically, life feels more spacious, because you are no longer crowded by what does not belong. In mythological language, this is the return from the underworld, not with treasures to display, but with a different way of standing in the light. You do not preach what you have learned. You do not attempt to awaken others. You know now that awakening cannot be transmitted. It occurs when the psyche is ready to bear itself. And so you live differently, not loudly, not covertly, but truthfully. You speak when there is something to say. You withdraw when there is not. You remain when presence is real. You leave when it becomes performative. None of this feels cruel to you anymore, because cruelty requires intention to harm. What you enact now is simply fidelity to what is. The deepest paradox is this: in cutting people off without anger, you have not become less loving. You have become incapable of false love. And false love, though praised endlessly, is one of the most destructive forces in the human psyche. False love binds, real love releases. And release, when it comes from wholeness rather than resentment, leaves no scar. You stand now in a quieter place, not isolated, not exalted, simply undivided. This is what remains when the psyche no longer needs to borrow itself from others. Not peace as comfort, not detachment as defense, but an inner agreement so complete that even loss no longer feels like an argument. And from here, life continues not as a problem to be solved, but as a movement to be inhabited, one step at a time, without noise, without apology, without anger,